dairy do to your system?
Dairy foods, well, let's back up a little bit. If we were to go back in time, let's go back to what we would consider sort of prehistoric era in the East, right? So this is Neolithic China, maybe the Bronze Age, right? And so at this period of time, often the physicians of the time, the doctors, would carry their supplies and they would travel from hamlet to hamlet, village to village, applying their trade, right? Was possible that they would be treating people down by the shore, treating people up on the plateau, going over to the mountainous regions, to the valleys. And they noticed that there were different sorts of illnesses that were being suffered by the people from these different geographical locations, right? The people down by that live at the beach get a certain type of diseases, and the people up in the mountains get other types of diseases. And so they started to want to try to find out why. What were the differences, the different factors that allow these different disorders to exist? The theoretical model they used was that the body has an imbalance that leads to these disorders. And they were very concerned with the various effects of food on the system, right? So this is a cultural predisposition to look at food and to try to figure out what effect does any specific food have. Well, at that time, there was a cow culture in China. They were keeping cows, and they were consuming the dairy foods, the dairy products from that. And this was in ancient China. The physicians of the time noticed that within this population, the dairy-consuming population, because you see, only a small portion of the population consumed dairy foods. Up in the mountains, they couldn't have cows, and they certainly didn't trade, with cheeses and milk and things. Down at the shore, the same thing. They ate fish, right, and vegetables. So they found that with the dairy-consuming areas that they visited, there was a sort of a flowering of diseases of phlegm. So they linked what they called phlegm and associated it with dairy consumption. They probably saw a higher degree or a higher rate of allergies, infection, and asthma. If we look at the classical texts, they're really pretty much describing allergies and asthma, right? And identifying that with the consumption of dairy foods. But you notice that more of those people had it than anyone else. So they made this correlation. But there were unfortunately more correlations to be made. First off, the idea was that the dairy foods cause phlegm in the body. But then they noticed there were some other things that happened as well. In the hands, the knuckles, or the knees, there would be nodules, basically raised, painful bumps. These show up on the joints, often the thumbs and the knees. And what would happen would be that eventually they deform the hands, deform the body, right? These were called phlegm nodules by the ancient physicians. Phlegm nodules, doesn't make much sense to us because we think of phlegm as just existing in the sinus cavities. But the reason they were called phlegm nodules was because they were sort of noticed that they had a high rate of incidence amongst dairy consumers. And so the idea that dairy caused phlegm and dairy caused this disorder meant that this must be another type of phlegm. Phlegm of the joints, right? Well, we call this arthritis, right? It's just a different name. It's another sort of an autoimmune disorder, right? You have asthma, which is an autoimmune disorder, and you have arthritis, two different autoimmune disorders. And both were found to be linked by these ancient physicians to dairy consumption. So that's kind of more ominous, isn't it, than a stuffy nose, a little more worrisome. Well, there was unfortunately another much more serious type of phlegm. Toxic phlegm nodules. These are bumps that show up in the breast of women. They show up between the legs of men. They get bigger, they spread, and then you die. We believe that, and there's a lot of evidence to show that these ancient physicians were observing prostate and breast cancer. They were observing this as it occurred in the ancient world, and they associated it with dairy consumption. So these were another type of phlegm according to their analysis. Now in our lexicon, right, asthma, arthritis, and cancer are just vastly disparate diseases that couldn't have the same cause. Right? And yet, more than 1,000 years ago, maybe between 15 and 1,800 years ago, ancient physicians in the East made this correlation with dairy consumption. And as a result, we see that the Asians as a whole forsook dairy foods. You don't find dairy-based choice foods in any cuisine associated with the Far East. The Chinese, Japanese, or Koreans, dairy foods were considered off the table because they were considered unhealthy. 1,500 years ago, no chemicals had ever even been isolated. No hormones were fed to these cows. These cows were completely, much more organic than anything we could achieve now, right? Because now we have actual air pollution, and right, even if you have an organic farm, right, your cow's going to have some lead in its body just by virtue of the fact that we had lead in gasoline in the 60s. Whereas back then, we're talking the cleanest dairy foods you could possibly obtain. And yet they were still associated with these rather difficult, rather ominous health problems.